US President Donald Trump has announced an additional 10% tariff on Canada. That's over and above what Canada is paying now. This comes just 2 days after US ended trade talks with Ottawa. Trade tensions have escalated between the US and Canada. At the center of it all is a Canadian advertisement that features Republican icon Ronald Reagan. Trump is fuming at the ad. He calls it fraudulent. So, what is the Ronald Reagan ad controversy all about? Let's connect the dots. At the heart of the recent US-Canada trade dispute is a Canadian government advertisement that uses old audio of former US President Ronald Reagan. The ad was produced by Ontario Premier Doug Ford's government. It features audio clips from Reagan's 1987 speech where he said tariffs harm every American. The ad was designed to promote free trade while indirectly criticizing President Trump's protectionist policies. This ad has enraged Donald Trump. Trump is accusing Canada of twisting Reagan's words out of context to undermine his current pro-tariff policies. The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute has criticized the ad too. It stated that the ad used selective audio from Reagan's April 25, 1987 radio address on free trade and edited it in a way that distorted the former president's intentions and messaging. It said that the Ontario government neither sought nor obtained permission to use or edit these remarks. It suggested it was considering legal options in response to what it described as misrepresentation. An angry Trump cancelled trade talks with Canada and imposed an additional 10% tariff on Canadian goods. He called this a retaliatory move against Canada's hostile action. Ontario later agreed to pull the ad to calm tensions and potentially reopen trade discussions. So, how did the ad emerge and who is behind it? Ontario Premier Doug Ford reportedly played a central role in the Reagan ad controversy because his provincial government funded and approved the anti-tariff advertisement that aired in US markets. When Trump reacted angrily, calling the ad fraudulent, suspending trade talks and imposing an extra 10% tariff, Ford first defended the campaign. He said it was meant to spark a conversation about how tariffs hurt workers and businesses. He described the message as authentic because it came from the greatest president this country has ever seen, Ronald Reagan, and expressed hope that Reagan Republicans would prevail over Trump's MAGA faction. But after discussions with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and growing economic pressure, Ford announced he would pull the ad starting Monday so that trade talks can resume. The ad was broadcast during the first two games of the MLB World Series this past weekend. The ad campaign specifically targeted US audiences at a time of high television viewership and was paused only after the weekend games concluded. As Ford said, the objective was to spark a debate on tariffs at the highest levels of US society, and that the ad achieved its goal of getting Americans and Trump himself to pay attention to the cost of tariffs. But Trump took exception to this. Just before complaining for his Asian tour, he accused Canada of playing dirty. He said, and I quote, "Canada, that's why I pulled everything. Canada, they wrote, they did a crooked ad. They knew Ronald Reagan loved tariffs. What they did is really dishonest. And I heard they were pulling the ad. I didn't know they were putting it on a little bit more. They could have pulled it tonight. Well, that's playing dirty, but I can play dirtier than they can, you know." Meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said he was willing to pick up the thread of trade negotiations from where it was left off whenever Washington is ready, because a breakthrough will benefit workers in the United States and Canada and families in both the countries. The average Canadian is not amused by Trump's decisions. Here's the sentiment on the streets of Toronto in Canada.
I think this is a great video for Trump to be able to see it. Most important is to remind him of its new tariff that is putting into the system, especially in the United States and Canada and Mexico, who also have been affected.
The interesting thing about the video is that it's a quote from 1987, where President Ronald Reagan is talking about the context where a Japanese sector is coming in, and Reagan is using tariffs in a limited short period of time to try and create a fair and balanced negotiating tactic with a trading partner who he saw was offside. And it's troubling to me to see that that video is being characterized as being pro-tariff. It's not. He says he's loath to use tariffs as a bargaining mechanism with the Japanese nation in 1987. This is right before the U.S. signs a free trade agreement with Canada.
I think that what he did was only one-sided. He has no relationship with us. He doesn't want a relationship with us. And what he did is totally against how anybody will negotiate. His negotiation skills, in my eyes, are very limited.
So, what is the nature of the trading relationship between the US and Canada? Canada and the US rely heavily on each other for trade, but not in the same way. Going by the figures, Canada is much more dependent on the US. About 77% of Canadian exports are to the US and 63% of Canadian imports are from the US. $1 out of $5 in Canada's economy comes from selling goods and services to the US. For the US, trade with Canada is important but less dominant. Only about 18% of US exports go to Canada and 14% of US imports happen from Canada. Having said that, for some sectors, US relies heavily on trade with Canada. For instance, Canada supplies most of the oil and natural gas that the US imports. About 60% of US imported oil comes from Canada. Canada's energy exports are critical for US industries and households. Many cars, trucks, and auto parts are traded between the two nations. 27% of Canada's exports to the US are vehicles and related parts. And here's where the US-Canada tariff situation stands currently after the ad controversy. While the US has raised tariffs to 35% on most Canadian goods, about 85% of Canadian exports still enter the US without tariffs, protected by the Canada-United States-Mexico Free Trade Agreement or USMCA. So while the headline rate is 35%, most trade in key sectors like energy, agriculture, and manufactured goods remains exempt. On sector-specific levies, however, the US has imposed a 50% tariff on Canadian metals like steel and aluminium and a 25% tariff on Canadian automobiles. Most Canadian tariffs on US goods were removed in September this year, except a 25% tariff that still applies to steel, aluminium, and cars imported from the United States. Both sides have excluded these sectors from free trade exemptions under the USMCA agreement. While Canadians are affected by the trade friction, Americans are not insulated either. Economists warn that the suspension of trade talks could raise prices for US consumers on goods like cars, appliances, and lumber. These sectors are significantly dependent on Canadian imports, and any disruption to trade tends to drive up costs due to limited alternative sources of supply. Now, even if the controversial ad is dropped, it is not clear if US-Canada trade negotiations will resume. For now, it's a pause with no clear timetable for when talks will restart. That's all in this edition of Connecting the Dots. We'll see you in the next episode with more raging issues. Until then, it's a goodbye from all of us in the Delhi newsroom. This is Munmun Bhattacharya signing off. Take care and stay safe.